Hello everybody. Now today I would like to have a look at Adam Thorpe's poem On Her Blindness, taken from the Edexcel Poems of the Decade anthology for English Literature A-level. Now, like many other poems in this collection, such as Effects and A Minor Role, this poem explores physical deterioration through illness and the accompanying sense of loss that comes with it. As it says here in the poem summary, the poem describes how the speaker's mother and her family respond to her blindness, her physical deterioration. The mother confesses how regular, ordinary acts such as watching the TV and eating are very difficult. And rather than confront her illness, she pretends to ignore it or laugh it off by visiting art exhibitions and driving the old Lanchester car. So within this poem, society's refusal really to confront death and look death in the eye is also scrutinised. The idea of pretense, putting on an act, is something that's also explored. And even the speaker, just before his mother dies, forgets her blindness, and as he describes the quite beautiful autumn scenery that's outside. And in the end, the poem concludes, and the poet concludes, should I say, that her death makes her no more sightless, but now she can't pretend. So I want you to think about this idea of pretense, the idea of putting on an act, of making something appear different from how it is in reality. Now, before we dive into the poem, I just wanted to make a note on the poem's title. The poem's title, On Her Blindness, is actually a literary allusion to a famous sonnet by John Milton called On His Blindness. Now, John Milton went progressively blind and eventually lost his sight. And in this poem, he initially chafes at his condition and bemoans his condition, and he claims that it limits his ability to serve God. But the main thing about this poem, On His Blindness, is that it ends with a resolve to bear his loss patiently. There is a stoic response to illness, that he kind of puts up a resolve and a determination, and he says that they also serve who only stand and wait. So in a sense, Thorpe's poem is a counter-argument to Milton's. It's a rebuff of Milton's stoicism, of those who, as it says in the poem, bear it like a Roman and put up with illness and affliction without any complaint. Blindness, as we will see in this poem for the speaker's mother, is a living hell, and the poem documents these struggles. So it isn't really an argument for a more stoic outlook. It is a more open and honest depiction of life with an illness. So it provides a counter-argument to Milton's original poem. Now, I've mentioned this word stoicism a fair bit. Now, stoicism is it's kind of a philosophical school of thought. It's the idea of enduring pain and hardship without displaying emotions and without complaint. So almost like a stiff upper lip attitude. It is commonly associated with probably a stereotypical British attitude to things. Now, if we're looking at some of the key tenets of Stoicism, these would be recognise what you cannot and cannot control. You determine your reaction to a crisis, so this lack of emotion, this resilience and determination. Ignore people dominated by their own negative emotions, master yourself, and learning how to move on. So within this poem, we see this philosophy of Stoicism throughout. And like I said, this poem provides really a counter-argument to Milton's strongly Stoic belief. And this poem explores some of the more realistic and honest hardships of living through illness. So moving on to the start of the poem then, it begins, "My mother could not bear being blind, to be honest. One shouldn't say it. One should hide the fact that catastrophic handicaps are hell." Now, immediately from these opening lines, we begin to see the idea of honesty and pretense develop. The mother admits in a quite honest way that she can't bear being blind, and that her situation is hell. And we see here that the narrator says one shouldn't say it. And this introduces the idea of pretense and illness being linked strongly with taboo, something that you just shouldn't speak about. And we see this in everyday life, don't we, of people trying to put on an act, trying to make things appear different to how they are in reality. And it says here that you should try and hide the fact that your illness is hell, and that we should try to keep it under wraps and out of public view. And this links, as I've said, to the idea of illness being a taboo subject, something that you shouldn't speak about. Handicaps are hell, one tends to hear publicly from those who bear it like a Roman, or somehow find joy in the fight. Now, this simile here, to bear it like a Roman, emphasises a quite stoic, stiff upper lip outlook on life that is commonly associated with British attitudes, in fairness. And it claims here that the mother is attempting to put on this pretend illusion that things are okay. But here we see a very difficult tension between honesty and pretense and fakery. And the speaker also comments on those who somehow find joy in the fight of adversity, being determined and resilient throughout adversity. And we see this a lot with regards to illness. And we certainly saw it during the COVID pandemic. Very, very quickly when people are ill, the kind of battling and fighting metaphors start to arise, don't they? Claiming that someone's a fighter, that they'll get through something, when really, actually, illness, to being the recipient of illness, is quite a passive act. You can't really do much about it, particularly in the case of really serious illnesses. But we are very quick to turn to quite fighting, battling metaphors in the face of illness. She turned to me once in a Paris restaurant, still not finding the food on the plate with her fork, or not so that it stayed on. Try it in a pitch black room, and whispered, "It's living hell, to be honest, Adam." And again, we see this sense of honesty developed, and this time in quite an ironic setting. Paris obviously is a city that has associations with elegance and love, yet here the mother is confessing to the real hardships of her illness. And we get this quite almost comic image of her trying to find the food on her plate with her fork. And you'll see in this poem there is a blend of humour and pathos throughout it. Notice also how the mother whispers to her son, Adam. "It's living hell, to be honest," she whispered. Again, highlighting that idea of illness being a taboo subject and something, as it says earlier in the poem, that you shouldn't say and that you should hide away from the public. And this exchange between the mother and the son sets up a tension between honesty and candour with pretense, lies, and putting on an illusion that things are okay. So it creates a sort of division between what can be said and what can't be said. And notice here, even in this first opening few lines, we have two references to honesty directly. A point there that I've also made on this slide that I wanted to come to is, even from this opening, you can see that there is frequent use of enjambment across the different stanzas. They are only in couplets, and this creates quite strong visual breaks between the stanzas and makes the poem's form quite difficult to negotiate. So if you think about these visual breaks and the kind of difficulty in negotiating this form, this somewhat mirrors the physical deterioration of the mother and the loss of her sight. "If I gave up hope of a cure, I'd bump myself off. I don't recall what I replied, but it must have been the usual sop, inadequate, the locked-in sun." Now, what we see from the mother here is quite colloquial and euphemistic language, claiming that if she didn't have any hope of finding a way out of this, she'd bump herself off. Now, bump myself off obviously is a colloquial term for killing herself and suicide. And again, we do see this blend of a very personal authentic voice with quite a large degree of emotion and pathos within the poem. And the son, the speaker, is unable to match his mother's honesty and candour. He can't even remember his inadequate response, and he claims that it must be the usual sop, the usual inadequate, banal language that we sometimes use in the face of illness or when we hear something that we don't want to hear. It's quite fitting as well that he describes himself as being locked in, as if he can't do anything about her illness, as if he can't adequately respond to her sense of loss and deterioration. When ironically, many would argue that it's actually the mother who's a lot more locked in because of the lack of her sight. She kept her dignity, though, and that's quite important. The speaker of the poem is keen to stress that she doesn't completely deteriorate. She kept her dignity throughout her deterioration, but she doesn't completely kind of fall to a sense of ridicule. She kept her dignity, though, even when bumping into walls like a dodgem. Her sense of direction did not improve when cast inwards. No inbuilt compass, as my father joked. So here we see another simile that makes light of the mother's deterioration. Again, this blend of quite dark humour and pathos. So describing her as being like a dodgem is, again, like I said, making light of this sense of deterioration. But it does make the voice of this poem seem quite authentic. And again, there are signs of pretense, like all throughout this poem. The father jokes that she's got no inbuilt compass. And it says that instead she pretended to ignore the void, the blankness of her sight, or laughed it off. The father jokes here, and the mother decides to ignore the void and laugh it off. This is all responses that people can have in the face of illness and adversity. And it's all there to try to distract and pretend that the situation is a lot better than it is in reality. Sop, by the way, the speaker describes his response to the mother's confession that her life is living hell, and that if she didn't have hope of a cure, she would want to bump herself off, so to speak. The speaker describes his response as inadequate and the usual sop. Now, this word sop means that it's something of that his words are of no great value. And that it's basically these meaningless, somewhat phatic utterances that we can sometimes give to people in the face of illness. Wishing you the best, hope all's well, etc., etc. Don't say things like that. So he admits there that he's very limited in his response to the mother's illness, to his mother's illness. Or she saw things that she couldn't see, and smiled, as when the kids would offer the latest drawing or show her their new toy. So we'd forget, at times, that the long, slow slide had finished in a vision as blank as stone. Now here we see the mother creating an imaginary world. This idea of pretense again coming in. She pretends that she can see her grandchildren's toys. She smiles when she sees their latest drawing or new toys, and this is again the mother putting on this act and pretending that things are okay when they're not. We get this line break that's very cleverly done here by Thorpe, the long, slow slide that finished in a vision. Now notice how elongated that is, mixed with the sibilance, which emphasises the slow deterioration and decline of his mother. Now, although there are some instances of similes, largely speaking, there is quite sparing use of figurative language within this poem. But this simile here, as blank as stone, to obviously depict her lack of sight, is an image of absence, isn't it? It's an image of the absence of sight, as blank as stone, as if there is nothing there to be seen anymore. And that is a kind of fitting simile to describe her loss of sight. For instance, She'd continue to drive the old Lanchester long after it was safe down Berkshire lanes. She'd visit exhibitions, admire films, sink into television while looking the wrong way. Now notice the break there in between the stanzas. Now here we see all these activities that the mother is attempting to do. Exhibitions and admiring films, watching TV. These are all activities associated with sight. If we think about to exhibit something is to put something on show, to put something in view. And all of these are activities, even driving, obviously, these are all activities associated with sight, which further accentuate this sense of loss within the poem. And tragically, she sinks into the television while looking the wrong way. Again, an image that blends quite dark humour and a strong sense of pathos. As it says here, while looking the wrong way, highlights her predicament of what she describes as a living hell. And notice here that the mother has transitioned from being the observer of the world, the observer of her family, her grandkids, etc., to being the observed, to being the subject. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is often a position that can open itself up to humiliation and ridicule, but the speaker is very keen to assert that she kept her dignity throughout this deterioration. Compare that to effects where we see people drooling and to like groaning in the hospital ward. This poem is keen to assert that the mother kept her dignity throughout this process. Her last week alive, a fortnight back. Oh, there we go. That's an old Lanchester car, by the way. So her last week alive, a fortnight back, was golden weather. Of course, the autumn trees around the hospital ablaze with colour, the ground royal with leaf fall. I told her this, forgetting as she sat too weak to move, staring at nothing. Oh yes, I know, she said. It's lovely out there. Now, ironically, the last week that she was alive, the weather was golden and the trees are described as being ablaze with colour. And this is a reminder of the visual riches that she has now lost. And, in typical fashion, as we know already, the mother's response to this is that she continues the act of imagining that she can see it. She maintains this fiction. So even when close to death, the mother maintains the pretense, the fiction that she can see all that's going on out there. Now notice how this little passage here about the golden weather and the ground royal with leaf fall and ablaze with colour. This short little passage here across these two stanzas really lies in stark contrast to the quite conversational language that dominates the rest of the poem. We could say that this is a poem with a quite conversational tone, but it branches off here, no pun intended, to a quite descriptive piece of language around the weather and the trees. So the mother here maintains this fiction and which really accentuates, as I've said, the riches, the visual riches that the mother has lost. Dying has made her no more sightless, but now she can't pretend. The pretense is being shattered now. Her eyelids were closed in the coffin, and it was up to us to believe that she was watching somewhere in the end. So a really quite poignant and emotive ending to this poem. The fiction is ultimately lost. The pretense is shattered when it says that now she can't pretend. And the last line suggests that even after death, she is still subject to the quite comforting fiction which likes us to imagine the dead watching over us. Now, this can be read in two ways. It could be argued, actually, that in this final, quite sad line, this now she can't pretend becomes a metaphor for the reality of her death. And that the pretense in some way is continued by her family in their belief that she was watching. Now, this could be argued in a positive way that the sight that she lacked in life, at least in their minds, has been regained by her spirit in death. Or you could, more cynically say that this idea of fiction and pretense to keep us comforted rather, is just continuing, and that now it's up for us to pretend that she's watching over us. So the narrator actually acknowledges within this poem the lies that we tell ourselves in the face of fragility, illness, and aging. And this poem really interrogates how we as a society respond to these three things. And we're given quite a moving insight into the living hell that the mother has to cope with on a daily basis. We're told about the regular routines of eating, her lack of coordination, of bouncing against the walls like a dodgem, of the not watching the TV and the driving that she pretends to do but really can no longer do safely. So it's really a poem that's quite poignant on that front. Lastly, to speak about the form of the poem, I've already mentioned a little bit about this with regards to the visual breaks, but it's a free verse poem. It has no regular rhyme scheme or metre, and this is there to reflect the quite natural conversational tone of the poem. It's quite informal, it uses colloquial language at times, but it has an acutely personal and authentic tone. The frequent use of ajournement, as I mentioned, breaks up these units of the senses. It creates these visual breaks, which makes the poem at times difficult to read. Now, this reflects this sense of physical deterioration and the encroaching blindness of the mother. Okay, I hope you found that useful, and good luck with the rest of your studying. Thank you very much.